Senator, what do you think the implications are of the decision by the British to leave the European Union?
Well, obviously, I respect the sovereignty of the UK and their decisions, and well, it's not going to affect the U.S.-British relationship. I do think the deeper concern is about what it means for Europe. I actually think it strengthens Putin's hand. You know, the argument Putin has made for a long time is this anti-European argument. And in fact, in some of the nations that were once part of the Soviet Union, he's made this argument to come towards this new union he's trying to set up. So I do think in some ways, if you look at the world today and where it was 5 years ago, Europe is weaker and Vladimir Putin is stronger. And so there's concern about that. But ultimately, look, that's the decision of our allies in the UK, and it will not affect the special relationship we have with the British people.
Is it a good outcome, though, in terms of the United States' interests?
You know, ultimately, I think it has a greater impact on Europe than on the United States. Either way, we're going to have a very close and special relationship with the UK, and we're going to respect the decision that they made. It is concerning, right, that at a time when NATO is trying to repurpose its way forward, that there is this dual track issue with the EU that's fallen by the wayside in terms of what they've decided in the UK. But I think what we really need to focus on now is ensuring the unity in NATO. I think this actually makes NATO more important. Apart from the European Monetary Union and Economic Union, the issue of NATO needs to be reinvigorated more than ever before.
Because of the threat from Russia?
I think not only because of the threat from Russia, but most certainly because of the threat of radical Islam now coming across the Mediterranean and into Europe. We've seen already the attacks in Belgium, we've seen the attacks in France, we've seen attempted and thwarted attacks elsewhere. So because of all of that, I think NATO takes on a special purpose. One of our NATO allies right now that faces the greatest threat of ISIS is Turkey. I would not be surprised over the next few weeks to see major ISIS operations within Turkey itself.
In terms of the politics of this, do you see any parallels between the Brexit push and what's happening in American politics?
I think globalization, the kind of move of the economy to this global economy is having an impact in multiple countries around the world. I think the reality that we have a new economy, and the new economy is creating a lot of new jobs, but the people hired for the new jobs are not the same people that are losing jobs under the old economy. In essence, the people losing their jobs are not the ones being hired by the new economy. All of this has created an incredible amount of strain and friction all over the world. And so there's a sense in many countries around the world that this is because we're too engaged with this global economy, we're too engaged with the world. I think you see it manifested here in America. I think you saw it in that vote there. I think there's other places where you may see that pop up as well.
Do you see it manifested in America in the support for Donald Trump?
Sure. I mean, it's one of the fundamental arguments he's made, is that the U.S. Needs to isolate itself a little bit more from some of the other things that are going on around the world and focus on America first. And there are some elements of truth to that argument, but ultimately, again, not entirely, because given the dynamics that we now live in today, we cannot isolate ourselves from global events. We are the United States of America. We're not a small, irrelevant country. We are directly and immediately impacted by global events, whether we want to be or not, whether they're national security ones or economic ones. We're 5% of the world's population. If all we do is sell things to each other, there's only so much growth we can create. We need to be able to engage with economies all over the world. So, yeah, I think Americans want us to focus and put America first, and I think that's true for national security and economics, but I believe the best way to do that is to remain engaged in the world in a way that's good for America and good for democracy and good for free enterprise.
Do you have any concern about a kind of burn the system down mentality that some people have seen in the Brexit vote and that they see in American politics today that would disagree with your concept of being engaged in the world and say, stop it, that's what's ruining us. Let's, we've got to fundamentally change the system. The elites are wrong, the fancy economists are wrong, the members of Congress are wrong. Do you see that?
Well, I think it's good to hold the elites and the fancy economists and the Congress accountable for the decisions they make. And I do not believe it's an illegitimate argument for someone who works in manufacturing to argue, for example, don't do this because it'll cost us jobs at the expense of them going to another country. I don't think that's an illegitimate argument for them to make. I think it challenges policymakers to figure out how it is we can embrace a new economy we cannot avoid. The future cannot be stopped. It's going to happen. Whether we like it or not, automation is going to happen. The nature of the economy is going to continue to change. And what now is the challenge for us is, how do we benefit from it as opposed to be hurt by it? And that includes the things I've talked about, helping to retrain people, ensuring that those new jobs are created here. The opportunity to retrain people in manufacturing to get into even higher end manufacturing so they can get paid more and have more job security. I think that's the challenge for people like me who believe that while some of these trends are bad, there are other things about it that are very promising, and we've got to be able to harness that. You couldn't stop the Industrial Revolution. You're not going to be able to stop the 21st century economy, but we have to figure out how to benefit from it, not just be hurt by it.
You said when you were announcing your decision to run for re-election again about Donald Trump, you said some things were still worrisome to you. What's worrisome to you?
Well, on a lot of issues, he still hasn't defined himself, and I think he's in the process of doing that. Look, I'll give credit where credit is due. He gave a speech a couple of days ago I thought was pretty good. In fact, I believe it's the best speech he's given in this campaign cycle, and I think perhaps you'll see more of that in the weeks to come.
What did you like about it?
Well, going after, I think, exposing Hillary Clinton and the fact that, these arguments that people have, I think we have to remind ourselves, Donald is not running against George Washington or Abraham Lincoln here. He's running against Hillary Clinton, someone who has incredible ethical issues that need to be examined, someone whose time at the Department of State needs to be carefully looked at for its failures, both in foreign policy and Benghazi and in other circumstances that she needs to be held responsible for. And then just the drama that always surrounds the Clintons. Everywhere they go, scandal and drama seems to follow at a time when this country can't afford it. So I thought he did a good job of laying out that argument in that speech, and because it's important for people to know the choice before him. And she's not some historic, heroic figure. I mean, in terms of what she's going to bring to the presidency, she's not George Washington or Abraham Lincoln.
You said you didn't trust Donald Trump with the nuclear codes. Do you trust Hillary Clinton with the nuclear codes?
I think the argument goes deeper than that when it comes to her, and that is, what kind of foreign policy will she pursue, and where will it lead us ultimately to make decisions like that, dramatic as the one you just outlined. This is a person who has generally supported virtually all of the Obama agenda, whether it was the reset with Russia, which is blown up in our face, whether it was the pivot to Asia, which was largely rhetorical, but sent the message to Europe that we were disengaging from them, whether it was the Iran nuclear deal, which I believe will one day come to haunt us, whether it's the release of prisoners from Guantanamo, one of whom was sent to Uruguay and has now left Uruguay, headed to Brazil, and on his way back to Syria. And he's not going back to Syria to open up a chain of car washes. I mean, this is the things she supported.
But do you trust her with the codes?
Well, look, I think there's a process for the presidency, and once you assume the office, no matter who holds that office, I think that the reality and the gravity of it always weighs on these people. It's a very difficult issue to face. So I would hope that I can trust no matter who wins with the nuclear codes, but here's a better approach, and that is ensuring that we have a foreign policy to ensure that we never reach a point where something like that could actually happen, where nuclear weapons would have to be used, which in my mind, it obviously is the worst and most apocalyptic scenario possible.
Let me try it another way. The presidency on national security issues sometimes comes down to one person, by themselves in a room alone, no matter how much advice they've gotten. On those tough decisions, whether it's about the nuclear codes or about the other kinds of decisions a single president can make, you think that Donald Trump has better character and judgment in those alone situations than Hillary
So
Clinton?
that's the challenge Donald has over the next 2-3 months.
But what does Senator Rubio think?
Well, but there's a campaign, so that's what I'm going to watch now. I know Donald is a primary candidate trying to stand out in a field of 17 people. He is now the Republican nominee, and he's going to have the next 3 months to go out and make the argument to the American people and help us envision him as president. And these are the kinds of issues that he's going to have to earn people's trust. That's part of the process for anyone who runs. And so that's the challenge he has, and if he's up to it, I believe he can win this election. If he's not, obviously, it would be like anybody else who's not. They would cost him dearly. So that's the challenge he faces. His people say he's going to meet that challenge, and as someone who doesn't want to see Hillary Clinton win, we're going to give him the opportunity to make that argument.
But as someone who cares as much as you do about foreign policy and these important decisions, right now it's an open question for you. Which of the two of them would have the judgment and character in those moments that come down just to a president by themselves alone?
Well, and again, there is no scenario under which I would support or vote for Hillary Clinton, because beyond the issue of the nuclear codes, which is a scenario of apocalyptic proportions, there's all these other policy issues that lead up to that or any other issue. So here's what I would say to you. The election's in November, and the challenge before Donald Trump, and for that matter, Hillary Clinton, is no different than the challenge all candidates face every 4 years. And that is to make the argument to the American people over the next 4 months that they are the best qualified person to occupy the most important public office in the world. That's the challenge Donald faces. That's the challenge she faces. And if Donald can meet that challenge, he's going to win this election.
And for you, I mean, you said you didn't trust him with the nuclear code, so he hasn't met the challenge for you personally yet.
Well, I think ultimately, look, there's no doubt that during the campaign and during the primary season, I disagreed with a lot of the things he was saying, a lot of the things he was doing, and that remains unchanged. I don't back away from that. That doesn't mean he doesn't have an opportunity now over the next 4 months to prove me and others wrong. And if you talk to the people who are supportive of him, they're saying he's going to do it. And I believe as someone who doesn't want to see Hillary Clinton win, he's going to get that opportunity, and it's already started.
You said during the primaries, conservatives are going to ask, my God, what have we done? Are we at that point?
I think if you look at what happened in this campaign season, the issues that underpin the conservative movement were not necessarily what was determining the outcome of this election. And you had a lot of voices who claim to be or are from the conservative movement who decided to overlook all sort of ideological or policy differences in order to get on behind an attitudinal approach to politics. I disagreed with that. I still do. I think for years to come, if you see how the conservative movement's been divided, you have leading conservatives in our party and in our movement that are now looking for ways to affect the outcome at the convention, even now. My argument was that this was going to divide us against each other at a time when we needed to be unified. I've been proven right. That said, that doesn't mean that there aren't other things we should be working together on. And it's one of the reasons why I chose to run for re-election, irrespective of the presidency. We have 3 branches of government here, and one of them is the legislative branch, and in particular the Senate, that acts as a check and balance on the presidency, no matter who wins. And I want to make sure that we have people in the Senate that will act as a check and balance on the president, no matter who's elected.
I know you want to stay in the legislative, but there was a poll recently that has you as the most popular choice for vice president.
Yeah, well, it's too late for that. I'm running for the United States Senate from Florida, and you can't run for 2 offices at once, so.
Even if you were asked to not run for
No,
one?
that's not, for me, a viable option. And I said that months ago. The differences in policies that me and Donald have had are too big for something like that to work. It would be a distraction, quite frankly, to his campaign.
Let me ask you about some of those policies. The Supreme Court ruled that the president overreached on his authority in terms of deferring deportation. If a person is in the country illegally, maybe their children have been born here, if they're here and they've broken no other law other than the immigration law, if Donald Trump is president, should they worry they're going to be deported?
Well, I've said this before. Donald's argument is that he's going to create this program, and the reality of it is he can't do it. You can't round up and deport 11 million people. There are people that need to be deported. Criminals need to be deported. The guy that committed that horrifying murder in San Francisco needed to be deported. But you can't round up and deport 11, 10, 9 million people. The American people wouldn't stand for it once they saw what it would take to make that happen. But we can talk about the Supreme Court ruling for a moment, and then it'll touch on your question. There are 2 separate issues. Number one is, what is the right thing to do with immigration given the status quo? And the other is, what is the right way to do it? All the Supreme Court was talking about is this the right way to do it? Whether you think it's a good idea or not, does the President of the United States have the authority to write law and ignore existing law? That's what he did with DAPA. He does not have the authority. And no matter whether you support what he did or not, you cannot support how he did it. It undermines the Constitution. The Supreme Court ruled appropriately. On the issue of immigration, we do need to deal with the fact that we have millions of people in this country who have been here a long time, who have committed no other crimes other than violating our immigration laws, and so forth. And I believe they can be dealt with in a very reasonable way, but not until the American people have confidence that this problem is under control once and for all. And that's why I argue for a piecemeal, step-by-step approach that begins with enforcement and I think leads to the confidence we need from the American people to do something reasonable but responsible about people facing these circumstances.
People might say, while you're going through your step-by-step approach, that's essentially de facto amnesty for those who are here illegally, while you're building up the security measures you say are the precondition.
Well, that's my argument for what the status quo is now. That's why I thought we needed to do something 3 years ago. That's why people that insist on comprehensive immigration reform are ignoring the reality that the votes don't exist and it isn't going to happen in one massive piece of legislation. And every year that goes by that we wait to act, the problem gets harder to solve.
Here's a challenge re-elected Senator Marco Rubio will face in 2017. If Donald Trump is elected, there will be an effort to deport 11 million. If Hillary Clinton is elected, she said she will present comprehensive immigration reform to the Congress. Which one is the better starting point to get to what you want?
Neither will happen. In essence, Donald is not going to. I mean, he's already kind of even backtracked from that a little bit and said that there's flexibility here about how this is dealt with. People do need to be deported.
I don't know. I talked to him about it. He sure seems like he wants to deport those 11 million.
Again, I think that there are people that need to be deported, criminals, people that are dangerous, quite frankly, people that haven't been here very long. You know, there has to be a cutoff point. It can't just be anyone who comes that gets to stay. So I don't think that's what's going to happen. No matter what he says on the campaign. And on the other side, she's wasting. First of all, I would ask her, why didn't the Democrats do that 8 years ago when they controlled the House, the Senate, and the presidency? Instead, they focused on Obamacare. Second, the votes aren't there. There's less votes today for comprehensive reform than there was 2 years ago, 4 years ago.
But of those two presidents, which is the better starting point for what you want?
The best starting
one
point.
of them's going to be elected.
Well, I would hope then to encourage. First of all, it doesn't matter, because in the end, the legislation comes out of the Congress, not out of the president. And the president can propose, but it's the Congress that has to actually shape the agenda and what it looks like. And I would argue that if we're going to move forward on immigration, it must begin first and foremost by proving to the American people that we are going to enforce the law, that the illegal immigration problem is under control. And only after you've done that can you begin the conversation about what do you do with someone who's been here a long time, who's otherwise a good person, who hasn't violated our laws except for immigration, et cetera. It's not going to happen until you do enforcement first.
Another scenario for the newly elected senator, if that happens, Donald Trump is president. He says he will have this temporary ban, which believes he has the authority as president to do. What does Senator Rubio do when the executive does that?
Temporary ban on?
About Muslim immigration, excuse me.
That's also not going to happen, and there's two reasons why. For example, we talk about ISIS and the need to defeat ISIS, and one of our great partners in defeating ISIS are Kurds in Kurdistan, who I visited a few weeks ago. They're Muslims. You go and see some of our troops embedded around the world that many times are in the front line of going into communities and working alongside these communities to defeat ISIS. They're Muslims. You see our best allies in Jordan, our allies in that region that are working with us to defeat ISIS. They're Muslims. You look at communities in America who are reporting to the FBI, we've got a radical here in our midst. They're Muslims. And so that's not a real proposal. It's not something that's going to happen.
But he thinks he has executive authority to do that. If he did, would Senator Rubio do something to undo that or thwart it?
I think it's bad policy for the country to say you're going to have a religious exclusion. And I think you've heard from multiple leaders in our party say that. And by the way, I believe, or I would hope, that we would have the opportunity to encourage him, if he's elected president, in a different direction about how to deal with the problem he's trying to deal with, is radical Islamic terror. And I believe we will be able, or I hope we will be able, to encourage him in a different direction from that.
He also suggested profiling might be necessary to capture or surveil those who would be radical in the United States.
Well, that's a more delicate issue because people call it profiling. Sometimes I call it common sense. Yes, if you know that the vast majority of radical Islamic terror is being motivated by websites that are populated by people that are searching for radical speech or going to mosques that are having radical speech, there is nothing illegitimate about saying we're going to go to the places and look at the places where their radical activity is occurring. And I don't think that's profiling. I think that's common sense police and national security practices. I think that's different from saying we're going to stop every Muslim American and look into your background. I mean, I don't think any of us believe Kareem Abdul-Jabbar is a threat to national security. And he's a Muslim American and a proud American and someone who, Muhammad Ali, who just recently passed. I mean, there are millions of Americans that fit that sort of profile that should not be. And we don't need to be wasting time looking at. But we do know the profile of a radical imam, of a radical mosque, of radical websites. And those are the places that law enforcement, the FBI, and others will have to look at. I don't consider that profiling. I consider that common sense.
There were some votes on gun control in the Senate. Nothing happened in terms of trying to restrict gun ownership from anybody who'd been investigated. What happens investigated in terms of terrorism? What happens now?
Well, I think what needs to happen is we need to have a real effort to actually pass something that solves the problem. What is the goal? The goal is twofold. We want to be able to keep guns or anything that's dangerous out of the hands of criminals and terrorists, but we want to be able to do so in a way that doesn't undermine the Second Amendment right of law-abiding Americans. Okay, that's the balance, and we have to achieve them both. None of these proposals that I saw achieved both of them fully. There were three proposals I voted for that I think were a better approach, but they don't go all the way there. So there are issues like the case of Mateen in Orlando. He was on a watch list. He was then off a watch list. So if you wanted to prevent Orlando, you had to have a proposal that allows you to look back for 5 years or whatever at people that were once on the list. But you also have to have a proposal that ultimately, even if the FBI is notified, there's no guarantee they would have actually gone out to see what he was up to because the sheer volume of people they have to look at is so extensive. And by the way, had Mateen not been able to purchase a gun at a gun store, within 15 minutes, he could have purchased the same guns or worse off the black market in the street or built an explosive device and perhaps killed even more people. This is a real challenge, and there is no silver bullet. And denying law-abiding Americans guns is not going to solve the problem of criminals and terrorists acquiring guns, but it's an issue I want us to move on. We need to learn from Orlando and pass laws that would actually prevent future Orlandos.
If you're reelected to the Senate, what do you want to do?
There's a lot of things I think are important. The first, of course, is I think the Senate needs to fulfill its role as a check and balance on the president, no matter who it is. And that means the president of our own party. And if we agree on something, we need to work together with that president. And if we disagree on it, we need to be willing to stand up to the presidency, even if they're of your own party. I think from a personal perspective, I remain on a macro scale, obviously. I think it's really important for America to fully benefit from this transition to the new economy. We can't stop the pace of progress. We either benefit from it or we're left behind by it, but we recognize people are being hurt by it. On the national security front, I continue to be very engaged, in particular on issues regarding the Western Hemisphere, which a lot of people in the Senate aren't paying attention to. And Florida, the third largest state in the country, on the leading edge of so many changes. First and foremost for us is ensuring things like the Everglades restoration is fully funded, which is not just impacting the Everglades, but these communities that are getting overrun by water.
Can those things that you want to do, other than being a check on the president, can any of those things happen in a Senate that that you described as a presidential candidate, as a place where things go to die?
I hope so. It's hard.
You were pretty tough on the Senate,
and I continue to be.
Why would you want to go back? 17% public approval rating.
That's a good question. I think for me it came down to, it wasn't my plan to run again, but I think it came down to whether or not you just give up on it. Do you give up, or do you say, I'm going to take one more crack at really hoping that this place gets better? I'm frustrated. As you said, I'm not alone. A lot of Americans are frustrated. Look at Zika, an issue that's impacting Florida. It took us forever to get anything, and even what we got is not enough. It's extremely frustrating, but ultimately it's the process we have, and we need people working within that process to make things happen, as long as hard as it may be.
Criticism of the Senate, and maybe of you now that you're running for re-election, is that senators go there now to use the platform to get noticed, and then to just criticize the Senate because everybody wants to be an outsider. So you go and you get the attention for being a senator, but you criticize the place for not getting anything done, and that's not a very healthy way to run.
I think the reverse would be to embrace the place and say, this is a great place, we're doing great stuff. I mean, people would look at you like you have three heads. There's no way you can make a straight-faced argument that Congress in general is productive. And both parties are to blame for this, by the way. But I mean, you've got to be realistic in the reality of it. That doesn't mean we throw away the Republic. It means we venture to figure out how we can make progress on these issues. And I would also say that in the periphery, there are a lot of things we have achieved that just don't get a lot of attention because they're either not controversial, like the Girls Count Act, which we reformed foreign aid so that to deal with what's happening with women and girls all over the world, whether it's some of the things we've done for Florida, whether it's the thousands of constituent service cases that we process every week, every month in the time that I've been in the Senate. Those things are very rewarding. You don't get you don't get a lot of press attention for them. But on the big issues facing our country, yes, there's a lack of progress. It's frustrating, and there's no other way. We have to admit that. I mean, we can't go around pretending it's not true.
What did you learn about the Republican Party running for president?
First of all, I learned the Republican Party is a diverse party. It truly is much more diverse than the Democratic Party. It has elements of libertarianism that are very strong. It continues to have its traditional elements of strong national security, pro-family, pro-constitution. It has a growing number of people that have been badly hurt over the last 8 years by the economic downturn, by the changes in the global economy. People call that populism. I just say it's people that have been hurt in their own lives. They're 55 years old, they were getting ready to retire, their house lost all its value, they lost their job, no one will hire them at the job they once had, and they're hurting, and they're angry. And the Republican Party's become a home for a lot of people like that as well. So it's a diverse party, and it's one of the reasons why you saw such a vibrant presidential primary.
Did you learn you can't run for president from the Senate?
No, I don't think that's true.
So you might do it again?
Well, I didn't run for the Senate to run for president again, because if you run, any political expert would tell you this is not the right way to do it. Expose yourself in another election, in a very unpredictable, to say the least, election cycle. After saying you weren't going to do it, it's a tough election in a strong swing state, is not the safest route forward. I'm running for re-election because I'm going to be a senator. I'm going to spend 6 years in the Senate making my mark on behalf of the people of Florida, but also on behalf of the things that are important for America.
Donald Trump help or hurt in Florida to get you reelected?
Well, obviously the better Donald does in Florida, the better it will be for other Republicans. But ultimately, I'm running for the Senate, and my argument needs to be, here's what I'm going to do as Florida Senator for the next 6 years, irrespective of who wins the presidential race. Because the Senate is not an employee of the president. The Senate is a co-equal branch of government that acts as a check and balance, particularly on presidential nominations, appointments to the court, etc. It's a separate branch. I am not running to be a rubber stamp for a Republican, and I'm not running necessarily to be a, blind obstructionist to a Democrat. If there's things we can work on, we will work on them together. If they're going in the wrong direction, Republican or Democrat, it is the job of the Senate to stop it. And I'll do that for the next 6 years, like I've done for 6 years now.
All right, Marco Rubio, thanks so much.
Thank you.